Here's a strange fact to start with. The highest mountain associated with a country isn't even inside its borders. Mount Ararat. Snow-capped, enormous, the spot where tradition says Noah's Ark came to rest, sits in Turkey. You can see it clearly from Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. It's on the national emblem. It's on the brandy bottles. Armenians paint it, photograph it, name their children after it. And they can't set foot on it without a visa because a border drawn in the 20th century put the mountain on the other side of a line that Armenia had no say in. That's not a quirky geography footnote. That's basically the whole country in one image. Something central to who you are, permanently visible and permanently out of reach. Welcome back to Around the World in Half an Hour. I'm Ray and this is episode 8, Armenia, a small landlocked country in the South Caucasus that's been keeping a version of itself alive for roughly 3,000 years, through empires that swallowed it, a genocide that scattered it, 70 years under Soviet rule, and a 2020s that's been genuinely brutal. We'll get into the ancient kingdoms, the church that predates most churches, the chess players, and the Kardashians. Yes, we're doing that. I'm not going to soften what's happened to this country in just the last few years, because pretending it's all monasteries and apricots would be dishonest. Let's get into it. Armenia is small, about 29,700 square kilometers, roughly the size of Maryland, or a bit smaller than Belgium. But small is misleading because almost none of it is flat. Around half the country sits above 2,000 meters, and the average elevation is close to 1,800 meters. This isn't a country with some mountains in it. It is the mountains, specifically the Armenian highlands, a raw, folded landscape of ridges, volcanic plateaus, and river gorges that was pushed up by the tectonic collision roughly 25 million years ago and hasn't calmed down since. Earthquakes are a real and remembered danger here. In 1988, a quake leveled the city of Gyumri and killed over 25,000 people. And that event still shapes how Armenians think about the ground beneath them. The highest point actually inside Armenia's borders is Mount Ararat, a dormant volcano topping out around 4,090 meters. Picture four Empire State Buildings stack on top of each other, then covered in scree and wildflowers, depending on the season. Rivers here don't meander so much as sprint. The Hrazdan and Debed carve fast, narrow valleys because there's nowhere flat for water to slow down. And then there's Lake Sevan, an enormous high altitude lake sitting at nearly 1900 meters, one of the largest alpine lakes on the planet, and functionally Armenia's ocean substitute. Landlocked countries adopt something as their sea, and for Armenia, it's Sevan. Beaches in July, monasteries on its shores, fish that show up on every restaurant menu within 100 kilometers. The climate swings hard between extremes because elevation controls everything here. The Ararat plain down low can hit 40 degrees Celsius in summer, while the mountains see winters plunging into minus 30 or worse. It's technically a subtropical latitude wearing a continental climate like a disguise because the altitude simply overrides the sun. And despite the harshness, the volcanic soil on that plateau is extraordinarily fertile. Armenia is one of the oldest continuously farmed and continuously wine producing regions on earth, which tells you something about how much people were willing to put up with for good dirt. Armenia is a landlocked country wedged between Georgia to the north, Azerbaijan to the east, Iran to the south, and Turkey to the west. And I want to be upfront that two of those four borders are currently closed. Turkey sealed its border with Armenia in 1993 in solidarity with Azerbaijan during the First Karabakh War, and it stayed shut for over 30 years despite periodic, mostly symbolic, normalization talks. Azerbaijan's border has effectively been a front line, not a crossing point, for decades. So, in practical terms, Armenia only really breathes through Georgia to the north and Iran to the south, which is an unusual and precarious way for a country to exist. Imagine half your doors being permanently bricked shut and having to root your entire economic life through the two that remain. That geography, sitting at the hinge between Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, has made Armenia a corridor for basically every empire that's ever wanted to move through this part of the world. Persians, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, Russians. Being strategically located sounds like an advantage until you realize it mostly meant being fought over repeatedly by people who weren't Armenian. And to the south and west lies the small Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan, separated from the rest of Azerbaijan entirely, which is its own tangle and one that's central to the peace negotiations happening right now, since Azerbaijan wants a corridor through southern Armenia to connect to it. Let's go back around 860 BC. The kingdom of Urartu, sometimes called the kingdom of Van, rose up around Lake Van in what's now eastern Turkey and became, for a couple of centuries, one of the most powerful states in the Near East, a serious rival to Assyria. Urartu isn't the same thing as Armenia exactly, ethnically and linguistically, it's a predecessor. One thread among several, including the Hayasa Adzi people, that Armenians would later weave into their own origin story. But this is where organized statehood on the Armenian highlands starts. Yerevan itself traces its founding to 782 BC to an Urartian fortress called Erebuni, which makes it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities anywhere. Urartu fell to the Medes and Persians in the 6th century BC, and what followed was a long run as an Armenian kingdom under various dynasties. Orintid, then Artaxiad, that peaked spectacularly under Tigranes the Great around 95 to 66 BC. Tigranes briefly built an actual empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean before Rome cut him back down to size. That's the high water mark of ancient Armenian power, and it's brief, a couple of decades, but it's foundational to how Armenians remember themselves, not as perpetual victims, but as a people who once ran their own show at serious scale. Then, in 301 AD, this is the detail that gets repeated in every Armenia conversation, and it's worth repeating again because it's genuinely wild. King Tiridates III made Christianity the official state religion. That's a full decade before Constantine's Edict of Milan legalized Christianity in Rome. Armenia is, by most accounts, the first state in world history to adopt Christianity officially. A little over a century later, in 405 AD, a monk named Mesrop Mashtots invented an entirely new alphabet specifically so the Bible could be translated into Armenian rather than borrowed wholesale from Greek or Syriac. That alphabet, 36 original letters, still in use today with a couple of additions, became the backbone of Armenian identity through everything that followed. When you don't have consistent political sovereignty for most of your history, language and script end up doing the work that borders usually do. And everything that followed is a lot. In 387 AD, the kingdom got carved up between the Byzantine and Sassanid Persian empires, and Armenian statehood essentially went dormant until the Bagratid dynasty restored a kingdom in the 9th century, which lasted until 1045. After that, Seljuk Turks, Mongols, and a long stretch where Armenians lived as a Christian minority under Ottoman and Persian rule, both of which viewed them with periodic suspicion precisely because they were a distinct, literate, church organized ethnic and religious group inside someone else's empire. That suspicion turned into a catastrophe in 1915. As the Ottoman Empire entered World War I and started losing badly, the government began a systematic campaign against its Armenian population. Mass deportations into the Syrian desert without food or water, massacres, death marches. Estimates generally land around 1.5 million Armenians killed. It is recognized as a genocide by most historians and by dozens of governments worldwide. And it's one of the 20th century's defining atrocities, occurring before the word genocide even existed as a legal term and before the Holocaust. Turkey disputes the term and the scale, officially describing the deaths as a consequence of wartime chaos rather than a coordinated campaign, and a disagreement that remains live and unresolved diplomatic issue between Armenia and Turkey today. This event, more than any king or battle, is why there are more Armenians living outside Armenia than inside it today. The global diaspora in Los Angeles, in Beirut, Paris, Moscow exists largely because 1915 scattered survivors across the planet. What was left of Armenian territory became a short lived independent republic from 1918 to 1920, immediately squeezed between a resurgent Turkey and the advancing Bolsheviks, before being absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1922. Soviet rule brought industrialization, forced secularism, and like everywhere in the USSR, repression. But it also meant 70 relatively stable years without the border chaos of the previous country. Armenia became the first non Baltic Soviet republic to formally move towards secession in 1991 as the whole union came apart. Independence in 1991 arrived at almost exactly the same moment as war. Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous region with a majority ethnic Armenian population, but placed inside Soviet Azerbaijan by Stalin in the 1920s, had already been fighting to join Armenia since 1988. The war that followed independence killed around 30,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands on both sides. And it ended in 1994 with Armenian forces controlling not just Karabakh itself, but a ring of surrounding Azerbaijani territory. For about a quarter century, Karabakh functioned as a self declared, unrecognized republic under Armenian protection. That arrangement collapsed in two stages. In 2020, Azerbaijan, backed by Turkish drones and military support, launched a war that reversed most of Armenia's territorial gains in 6 brutal weeks, ending with a Russian brokered ceasefire and Russian peacekeepers on the ground. Then, in September 2023, Azerbaijan finished the job, a rapid military offensive that, in the span of about a day, forced the surrender of what remained of Karabakh's defenses. Within days, essentially the entire ethnic Armenian population of the region, well over 100,000 people whose families had lived there for generations, fled to Armenia proper. The Republic of Artsakh, as Armenians call it, formally dissolved on January 1st, 2024, Human rights organizations, UN officials, and a number of legal scholars have described this as ethnic cleansing, and some have used the word genocide for the pattern of blockade, starvation, and forced expulsion that preceded it. Azerbaijan's position is that this was a legitimate reintegration of its own internationally recognized territory. Russian peacemakers, who had been stationed in the region to guarantee safety after the 2020 ceasefire, did not intervene to stop the offensive. And that has shaped how many Armenians now view Russia's reliability as a security partner. In August 2025, Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a US brokered peace framework in Washington, aimed at formally ending the conflict and opening a transit corridor nicknamed TRIPP, connecting Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave through southern Armenian territory. It's a real diplomatic step, but it's not a resolved situation. Displaced Karabakh Armenians have no guaranteed right of return. Prisoner and detainee disputes remain unsettled, and Azerbaijan is pushing for constitutional changes in Armenia that would formally renounce any claim to the territory, a demand that's politically explosive inside Armenia itself. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who's led the country since a peaceful protest movement called the Velvet Revolution swept him to power in 2018, has staked his political career on this peace process and on pivoting Armenia away from Russia and toward Europe and the United States. He won re election in June 2026 with just under half the vote in a campaign conducted under what Western observers described as significant Russian interference, disinformation, financial support for opposition figures, and pressure tied to Russia's economic leverage over Armenia, including gas prices and trade restrictions. The broader pattern is clear from the numbers and the diplomacy alone. Armenia is currently a small country being pulled in different directions by much larger neighbors. And its current government has chosen to align more closely with Europe and the United States than with Russia. Armenia's population sits at just under 3 million people, heavily concentrated in and around Yerevan, which alone holds more than a third of the country. That population figure has to be read against the diaspora. Most estimates put the number of ethnic Armenians living outside Armenia at somewhere between 5 and 8 million, spread through Russia, the United States, France, Lebanon, and beyond. So, Armenia, as a lived, felt identity, is genuinely bigger than the country's borders. The population is remarkably homogeneous, around 98% ethnic Armenian, with small Yazidi and other minority communities, which is itself a legacy of the 20th century's upheavals rather than some ancient unbroken uniformity. Religiously, this is an overwhelmingly Christian country, and specifically Armenian Apostolic Christian, tied to a church that traces its authority back to the 301 AD conversion and operates independently of both Rome and Constantinople. Economically, 2026 has actually been a genuinely strong year on paper. GDP growth above 7%, driven partly by a wave of Russian tech workers and businesses relocating to Yerevan since 2022 to avoid sanctions and conscription, which has pumped money and skilled labor into the capital's economy in a way nobody quite predicted. Inflation is running around 4%, which stings for ordinary households even as headline growth numbers look good. Beyond the tech and IT boom, the economy still leans on mining. Copper and molybdenum are major exports, along with agriculture, brandy and wine production, and a growing tourism sector. Education and literacy rates are both very high, a genuine holdover from Soviet era investment in schooling that Armenia has kept up since independence. National identity here runs on a combination of deep pride in the church, the alphabet, the ancient statehood, and a kind of hard won, unsentimental resilience because this is a country that has had to survive almost continuously rather than simply exist. Let's meet some of the remarkable people from Armenia, starting off with Mesrop Mashtots, the monk who invented the Armenian alphabet in 405 AD, not adapted, invented from close to scratch, specifically so scripture and Armenian thought could exist in Armenian rather than borrowed Greek or Syriac letters. It's hard to overstate how much cultural survival gets built on that one decision. Tigranes the Great, king from around 95 to 66 BC, took a regional kingdom and briefly turned it into an empire stretching from the Caspian to the Mediterranean before Rome stopped him. Armenians reach back to Tigranes the way some nations reach back to their one golden age of imperial power, because it's proof they weren't always the ones being conquered. Move to the 20th century and you get Charles Aznavour, French Armenian, one of the best selling recording artists in the history by some counts, a songwriter and actor who became, for much of the diaspora, the acceptable, dignified face of Armenian fame abroad. Armenians talk about Aznavour with a warmth that's genuinely different from how they talk about the next name on this list. Because the other globally famous Armenian surname is, of course, Kardashian. Kim Kardashian's father was a third generation Armenian American, and her fame has brought significant global visibility to the Armenian name and identity. She has repeatedly used that platform to draw attention to genocide recognition. At the same time, surveys and media coverage inside Armenia suggest real ambivalence about her as a representative figure, with many Armenians pointing instead to Aznavour as the public face they are proudest of. In chess, Levon Aronian has spent 2 decades as one of the world's strongest grandmasters, a multiple time world number three, and a symbol of a genuinely deep national chess culture. Armenia has, at various points, made chess a mandatory subject in primary schools, which is not a sentence you can say about almost anywhere else on earth. And Gary Kasparov, arguably the greatest chess player in history, is of half Armenian heritage on his mother's side. Born in Baku before the Karabakh conflict made that city's Armenian population part of history rather than present tense. And on the tech side, there's Alexis Ohanian, the Armenian American co founder of Reddit, a reminder that the diaspora's contributions to global culture and technology go well beyond entertainment. Armenian food runs on wheat, herbs, grilled meat, and fruit, and almost everything on the table traces back to the mountains and the volcanic soil. Start with lavash, a thin, soft flatbread baked in a clay pit oven called a tonir, which UNESCO recognized as intangible cultural heritage, a decision that annoyed several neighboring countries who make near identical bread and felt Armenia had claimed something regional as exclusively its own. That argument honestly tells you a lot about how food and identity get tangled up across the Caucasus and the Middle East, where borders are recent and cuisines are ancient and shared. Khorovats is the centerpiece of Armenian social life. Skewered, wood fired grilled meat, usually pork or lamb, marinated for a day and cooked slow over embers, served with charred vegetables, and obviously lavash to wrap it in. During the harder decades of the post Soviet 1990s, when meat was scarce, being invited to someone's khorovats meant life was genuinely good again. It has stayed a celebration food ever since. Dolma or tolma might be the closest thing to a national dish. Grape leaves wrapped around spiced minced meat and rice, slow cooked and served with a garlicky yogurt sauce called matsun. There's a vegetarian Lenten version, pasut stolma, stuffed instead with rice, beans, and dried fruit for fasting periods, which tells you something about how deeply the Armenian apostolic calendar still shapes what actually ends up on the plate. For something distinctly regional, look for zingalov. Zingalov hats, a flatbread stuffed with a dense mix of dozen or more wild herbs, a specialty from the Karabakh region carried into Armenian kitchens by displaced families, which gives it an extra layer of weight right now. And Armenian brandy, particularly the Ararat label, has an actual Cold War era legend attached to it. Stalin reportedly gifted a case to Churchill at the Yalta conference, and Churchill liked it so much he arranged for regular shipments afterward. Let's talk about some of the places you can visit when you visit Armenia. Geghard Monastery, partly carved directly into the cliff's face it's built against, is one of the most striking religious sites anywhere. A UNESCO World Heritage location that feels less built than grown out of the rock. Not far away, the Temple of Garni is the only surviving Greco-Roman colonnaded structure in the former Soviet Union, a pagan era temple that somehow outlasted the mass Christian conversion that followed it. Lake Sevan deserves a full day at minimum. The monastery perched on its former island, now a peninsula thanks to the Soviet era water diversion projects, the beaches in the summer, and ishkhan trout on every restaurant menu within reach of the water. The Khanzoresk cave village and swinging bridge down in the Sionic region connects two sides of a deep gorge and looks down on caves that people genuinely lived in until fairly recently. And Yerevan itself rewards a couple of days. The cascade, a giant tiered stone staircase doubling on an open air modern art museum, and the Matinederen, a research institute holding one of the world's largest collections of ancient and medieval manuscripts, including illuminated Armenian Gospels that survived everything the 20th century threw at this country. The currency is the Armenian dram, and as of mid 2026, the exchange rate sits around 365 to 370 dram to the US dollar. Though, as always, check a live rate before you travel. Armenia's economy is best described as a small, open, emerging market that's punching a bit above its weight lately, thanks largely to that post 22 influx of relocated Russian tech workers and capital. Day to day costs remain low by Western standards. A solid restaurant meal with wine can run you well under the equivalent of $20, which makes Armenia a genuinely affordable place to visit, even as headline GDP growth numbers look strong. The flip side is that plenty of that growth is concentrated in Yerevan's tech sector and hasn't necessarily reached rural areas or the tens of thousands of displaced people from Karabakh who are still working out what a permanent life in Armenia proper looks like. Two things dominate global awareness for Armenia: being the first Christian nation and Mount Ararat as the traditional resting place of Noah's Ark. Beyond that, most outsiders' mental image runs through either genocide history or, less seriously, the Kardashians. What gets far less attention globally is how much this small country has quietly contributed. The world's oldest known winery, found in a 6,100-year-old cave complex at Areni, a disproportionate global footprint in chess, and an alphabet that's been keeping a language and a culture intact for over 16 centuries through empires that would have happily erased it. Armenian folk music runs on instruments like the duduk, a double reed woodwind with a haunting, breathy tone that's become an international shorthand for mournful or exotic atmosphere in film scores. You've almost certainly heard a duduk on a movie soundtrack without knowing what it was. Sacred music has its own deep tradition too, particularly khash notation, an early medieval system of musical symbols used in the Armenian apostolic liturgy. On the visual and architectural side, Armenian church design, conical domes, cross-shaped floor plans, heavy volcanic tufa stone in shades of pink, black, and orange is genuinely distinctive within the wider world of Christian architecture. And it developed largely in isolation after that 5th century split from Byzantine church authority. Literature runs from Movses Khorovats, the 5th century historian whose partly legendary, partly reliable chronicle is still the starting point for how Armenians tell their own origin story, through the 20th century diaspora writers who process the genocide in fiction and memoir, because Armenia itself often wasn't in a position to do so. And in film, Sergei Parajanov, though he worked mostly within the Soviet system and is sometimes claimed by Georgia and Ukraine too, made The Color of Pomegranates, a film built almost entirely out of Armenian religious and folk visual imagery, and one that regularly shows up on greatest films ever made lists, despite being genuinely strange and non narrative by design. Chess isn't just popular in Armenia, it's closer to a civic institution. It was made a mandatory school subject in 2011, one of the only countries in the world to do that. And the national team has won the Chess Olympiad multiple times, including three golds between 2006 and 2012, with Levon Aronian anchoring the squad. Wrestling and weightlifting also carry real Olympic pedigree here, rooted in Soviet era sports infrastructure that Armenia inherited and, unlike some former Soviet states, actually kept functioning after independence. Football exists and has passionate local followings, but Armenia has never been a major footballing power on the international stage. And most Armenians would probably rather talk to you about a chess opening than a football formation. Most people outside the region associate Armenia mainly with the genocide, Mount Ararat, and possibly the Kardashians, a fairly narrow snapshot of a much longer and broader history. First time visitors are often surprised by how walkable and cosmopolitan Yerevan feels, especially since 2022. With a growing cafe and tech startup scene alongside the more expected mountains and monasteries image. Armenia's language and script have remained intact across 16 centuries of political instability, and the 2018 Velvet Revolution stands out regionally as a peaceful, non-violent transfer of power. Since the 2020 and 2023 developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia's foreign policy has been shifting toward closer ties with the European Union and the United States, and away from its traditional alignment with Russia. So that's Armenia, a country that keeps a mountain it doesn't own on its coat of arms, invented an alphabet to help preserve its culture under centuries of foreign rule, and is still, right now, in the middle of a major geopolitical realignment. The through line across 3,000 years of its history is a repeated pattern of rebuilding. After 1915, after the 1988 earthquake, after the 2023 displacement from Karabakh, that pattern of recovery is as much part of Armenia's history as any king. battle, or monastery. Next time we head to the Bahamas. Sunshine, sovereignty, and a very different relationship with the sea than the one we just left behind. Thanks for listening to Around the World in Half an Hour. If you've enjoyed this one, follow the show and leave a rating, leave a review wherever you can. It genuinely helps people find us. Until next Monday.